the Deputy Minister of Women, Youth and Persons with Disabilities, that's Steve Letsike, says South Africa's teenage pregnancy figures for the 2023-24 financial year are concerning. South Africa has one of the highest rates of teenage pregnancy globally, with nearly 1 in 4 girls falling pregnant before they even turn 20. This is at least according to data provided by the World Health Organization. Meanwhile, figures released by the Health Department here at home show that more than 2,700 girls aged between just 10 and 14 are now mothers after giving birth at public healthcare facilities across the country. Let's unpack how on earth something like this is even unfolding. An expert in sexual and reproductive justice, Dr. Marion Stevens, joins us now via our video link. And Doc, it's great to have you on the SABC. Thanks very much indeed for making time to speak to us. You know, language is incredibly important as we try to understand the different dynamics around the society that is South Africa. And I wonder if we're using the right language to describe this phenomenon. Activists, for example, have long called for us to call these rapes as opposed to just teenage pregnancy. I wonder if you could just guide us through just thinking about that before we understand what underpins this phenomenon.
Good morning, Ayanda, and good morning to your listeners. And thank you for framing this discussion in this way, because I think this is very, very important to consider that those that have given birth that are around 10 to 14, that would be statutory rape. And we're not talking about gender-based violence. There are systemic failures that we are not addressing. And we've been talking about this for a long time, but we have sensationalized this as, you know, teenage pregnancies, irresponsible children, parents that are not parenting. But we need to get to the root of issues of gender-based violence and look at how it's beginning with young persons and look at how we're framing that. So, for example, I really think that we need to be looking and addressing gender-based violence in relation to teaching our children about consent. And one thing that I'd like to share with viewers is the concept of fries. Children like chips, they're fries. We need to teach children that consent is about not once off. It's about being able to give it freely. It is reversible. I, it needs to be informed. E, it needs to be enthusiastic. And S, it needs to be specific. And this would form part of comprehensive sexuality education, which a lot of people are afraid of and don't want to engage in. It kind of comes from some of the concerns from North America about the toxic kind of culture wars about we can't be teaching our children to have sex. This is not about teaching our children to have sex. This is about teaching our children about their bodies and about how to talk and talk about consent, which is addressing the root cause, perhaps, of gender-based violence.
I find it so interesting, Doc, that you make reference to those cultural wars that are taking place, even closer to home, by the way, because in my mind, even adults don't really have a grasp of the idea of what consent is and what it isn't. And the fact that, by the way, it can change in the moment. To what extent do you reckon that also forms part of the problem in how we drive home, you know, solutions around solving this particular phenomenon?
Spot on, Ayanda, spot on. I mean, consent is an issue that perhaps affects us throughout the lifespan, when we've seen this appalling realities of older women, gogos, being raped. I mean, it's actually just, it's unconscionable, and it's it's so difficult to understand and explain. But the reality is, amongst all ages, amongst all cultures, amongst all communities, we have failed. There's systemic failure, and we have not really taken time to understand and talk about what consent would really mean. A lot of it is informed by power relations, driven by patriarchy, beliefs about women, about gender equality. So I think we really need to start breaking this down and understanding and taking responsibility and being accountable for, who's responsible for comprehensive sexuality education. And I think different people fob it off onto different institutions. Is it the auntie? Is it the parents? Is it the family? Is it the schools? Is it the institution? Is it the education department's curriculum? But the reality is, what we've done is we're not talking to each other, we're blaming each other, we don't know where that responsibility lies, and essentially children are now getting that information from social media. And we know that that's a very, that some of it can be good if it's guided, but mostly it's not okay. And we cannot let that go by. So we need to be having discussions about how do we impart good information about the realities of consent, that it's not once off, that it needs to be informed, that it needs to be freely given, that it needs to be specific, that it needs to be enthusiastic.
Sure. People who are often outraged by these stories will direct that outrage at, the supposed fathers of these pregnancies. And, if it is a crime, a lot of people will argue somebody must be held accountable for it. How much do we know about, these people who are essentially committing these crimes of statutory rape, how they access these children, and how ultimately they're treated by the communities that they form a part of?
So to father a child, to be a father is a once-off, incident. And that's the reality, that we are not actually addressing the concept of what gender-based violence means, and picking up on who these people might be, whether they might be classmates, teachers, relatives, and generally it's somebody that's known to the person. And it's well known that we have appalling reporting rates, and we're not actually managing retributive or justice. The other reality that I want to focus on is that we're not focusing on that young person who finds out that they're pregnant, and what do they do. We're not focusing on options of improving contraception access if that child is sexually active and in a relationship and is trying to figure out how to consent and not to consent. So the contraceptive options that are available in our clinics are not, they're not well provided for. We have a very good policy, but we do not have the range of options on the shelves. Our health workers are not trained. Health workers that graduate currently have had, I think a lot of this is because of the culture wars, have had a dumbing down of their capacity. They're not taught how to do the insertion of an IUD, a contraceptive device. They're not taught how to do a pap smear. They're not taught how to even support women through abortions, even in the case of an emergency septic abortion. And so this is a real challenge as well. So our abortion facilities, 50% of them actually happen outside of the healthcare facility.
Sure.
And so you can imagine a young child, a young person who discovers that they're pregnant, and they've not been able to, who do they talk to? Do they get the information from social media, and where do they go to? And then they find out that they are pregnant late, perhaps because there's so much stigma and denial. Right. And who actually holds and cares for that young person? I think we need to focus on that young girl child. And I come from a health and justice perspective. I want to try and assist and work at the systemic failures in that regard. We've been talking about patriarchy and men taking responsibility and improving the criminal justice system for years. That needs investment, and that needs careful work as well.
Absolutely. It's the kind of story that really opens us up to so many other social ills. I mean, a recent report, for example, on HIV and AIDS trends has found that typically it is this cohort of people, young teenagers who are still the most vulnerable and need a lot of attention if we're going to sort out even that particular epidemic. But Dr. Marion Stevens, that's the time we have, at least for this Tuesday morning. Hopefully a whole lot more conversations around this important issue rather sooner than later.